tell us who you are and what the car is.
Okay. I'm Admiral Robert Phillips, and I'm sitting in front of my 1955 Ferrari. Its model is a 500 Mondial Series 2. It's a four-cylinder race car, double overhead cam, very, very competitive in the days it was born. I've owned the car since June of 1960, which is 53 years now that I've had this machine. In looking back over the time I've had the car, some things occur to me which are the perspective of ownership of a Ferrari. I feel that I am the custodian of this car. I don't truly own it. It's a piece of property that is unique. It was developed in the early 50s, back in the days when safety was not a concern for people who were racing and designing cars. The design of the body is right out of the mind of Sergio Scagliotti. I can feel under this fender and still feel the hammer marks when this body was formed. The color blue is because it was sold originally to a Frenchman, because back in the day you raced your country colors. Blue was France's racing color, as green was for Britain and silver for Germany, and of course red for Italy. In part of the business of keeping this car, racing the car in the 60s, there was not the concern that I have today. So maybe a lesson I should pass along is, if you have a unique piece of material, you should conserve it instead of modifying it and changing it to your perspective. Drawing a mustache on the Mona Lisa does not increase its value. So this car now is as close as practical to the way it was when it raced at the first Grand Prix of Venezuela. The number series of 8 on this particular one, it was a factory team car raced by Harry Schell and Eugenio Castellati, one of the premier drivers of the day. It won its class at the first Grand Prix of Venezuela. It won at the first Nassau races in 1955, driven by Porfirio Rubirosa, another man of some fame. The following day, he flew over to Miami to play polo and let Ebby Lumpkin from Cincinnati drive. He also took a first in class. And 3 months later, with a different paint job, Rubirosa and Jim Pauley took a first in class at the race at Sebring. So this car has an interesting early racing history. I raced it up until 1968, at which time it was just a tired old race car. I had just come back from Vietnam. I had finished my MBA at Harvard, and I was off to Hawaii for 4 years. And by that time, it was sort of just a piece of junk sitting in a corner. My son jokes that yes, some of the dents we had to take out later because he used to lean his bicycle up against it in the corner of the garage. In 2000, the family discussion was, what should we do with this piece of junk sitting in the corner? And the decision at that time was, we really ought to conserve it, bring it back to the way it was. And that turned out to be a very laborious project. Having had the car for 53 years, it had escaped some of the insults that other early race cars had with implants of Chevy V8s or whatever, wide fenders, lots of things that people did to race cars because they were just old race cars to make them go faster for the particular event or day. In going through that process, it took literally years of research to find out what was the early history of this car, because the history of the four-cylinder cars was at that time particularly undeveloped. Nobody knew which cars ran at which places as a collective story. So we went through the process of studying all race results all over Europe and in the United States, trying to isolate the four-cylinder car racers, and then trying to figure out which ones couldn't be the same car because they were in different locations. That was the basis for the framework of coming up with the ownership chain on this car. I had the help of practically every Ferrari expert in the world, the Gerald Roushers, the Marcel Massinis, the David Seilstads, and countless other people who have pictures and things, bits and pieces of history to help bring this car along. One thing I did find is that time marches along very quickly. The people who knew about this car, right now, everyone who drove this car before me is dead. When we started the research, only 2 were left alive, and one of them had Alzheimer's, and the other one passed not long after. So getting primary source for history is very important. What we finished up with was a car which has been conserved to the best of our ability. Some of the things that were not original at the factory were, we did a better job from the inside out. We did a better job from the inside out of protecting the metal. The original priming on the underside of the car was hit or miss. And so I would serve no purpose by conserving a car and not protecting it for the future generation to see. 50 years from now, whoever has custodianship of this car at that time won't have to worry about, is this metal now rusted completely through? If we go back to the early history, I was in the Navy. I was driving an MGA. I had a novice SCCA permit. And the car culture in those days was, in California, was sort of a fun collaboration. Driving down the highway, if you saw another foreign car, you waved. If it was another MG driver, they of course waved back. Triumph drivers waved back. Porsche drivers sometimes, Jaguar drivers never. And upon occasion, you would see one of those exotics from Italy, whether it was a Maserati or a Lancia or a Ferrari. We would spend weekends going over to Charlie Rizzagi's place in San Francisco and drooling over some of the exotica that he would bring in to sell to some of the Californians with more money. One weekend, the news at our local party was about a red sports car that had eluded the California Highway Patrol all the way down the eastern shore, from Vallejo down through Richmond, through San Leandro, Oakland, and south, and got away. And the speculation was, what do you think it was? Well, when they said, well, it might have been a Ferrari, one of the people there mentioned that Susie up there was talking about a Ferrari for sale just up the road. Well, natural curiosity probed me to go ask Susie, what was the story about this Ferrari? All she knew was that it was stored, her boyfriend told her that it was stored in the back corner of a Rambler dealership in Richmond, California. Now, Richmond, California, for those who don't know, is the equivalent of Elizabeth, New Jersey. It's an oil refinery town. And when I drove up and went into the Rambler dealership to look at this Ferrari, the people at the front counter were kind of, what do you mean? We sell Ramblers, not Ferraris. But someone mentioned there might be one in the back corner of the shop they were holding for somebody. So I go to the back corner of this shop, and here is this forlorn piece of junk. It is covered with filth, spray gun patterns, tests have been painted on the side of it. It's jacked up, there are no seats. There's this box, wooden box of these twisted, hot pieces of metal that have come out of the differential sitting there. And I'm thinking, and their hood is off. And I'm looking and saying, yeah, that looks like a V8 stuck in a Devon body. And I started to turn and leave when I thought, but I wonder what V8 they use. So I bent over and grabbed a rag off the floor, wiped off the valve cover, and Ferrari. The red mist struck. I have to save it. As my mother said much later, that's when you took loss of all your rational sense. Well, after a lot of checking around and finding out how much it was going to take to fix the car, it turned out that the only way it was going to happen was if I learned mechanics myself on that car and put it back together myself with the help of a machinist out in town and some of the airframe guys who taught me how to form and weld, gas weld aluminum. Painting it, taking it out, running it in a hill climb, taking first in class, beating previous year's course record, does wonders for your ego. Now people ask, what's it feel like at 24 to have a competition Ferrari? The feeling is very hard to describe because it was a race car. I didn't at that time have any sense of the specific history of this car. No idea that it had been a Grand Prix winner from its early days. No idea of some of the famous drivers who had driven it. All I knew was that it went faster than my MGA, and that other people with Ferraris were kind of looking over their shoulders and saying, So now when people in MGs waved at me, I would wave back, kind of trying to break that mold. I was subsequently moved to Turkey by the Navy, and when I returned from Turkey 2 years later, I was assigned to New Jersey. So I hadn't had the daunting task of what do I do with this car sitting in California? Well, you bolt on a muffler and you drive it from San Francisco to New York. That's what you do. This day I kind of wonder about the wisdom of that trip. This body could not make it today. The run-up in prices in '89.
Yeah.
$500,000 seems like.
I thought it was good because after the slump in '91, it went down to $500,000.
Yeah, because it was before the show in 2008 when the $2 million offer. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Interesting thing is when you take the car to car shows this day and age, there are a couple of things that go on. One of the roles I see that I'm responsible for is very few people at car shows in particular, and especially at Ferrari car shows, have no idea of the early history of the four-cylinder cars. They don't realize that the first world championships that Ferrari got in Formula Racing were in four-cylinder cars 2 years in a row. That world championship, or Mondiale, was the basis for the car's name, which is Mondial. The second question I get is, so how fast will it go? Well, being a race car, it does not have a speedometer, so I don't have a quick, easy answer. I can tell you how fast my engine will turn in whatever gear I'm in. And the third question is, what's it worth? There are a lot of snappy comeback answers to that question. I'm taken back to the years of the late 80s when the Ferrari car market left the hands of the enthusiast and jumped into the hands of the investors. Investors could buy a Ferrari in 1987, and in 13 months they could turn around and sell it for double their money. And fairly soon you had investors buying cars about which they knew nothing. So car values were really skyrocketing. Every couple of years I used to be getting letters from people asking me to sell my car. In 1989, just before the bubble burst, there was one offer from Japan for right at $1 million once you convert the yen back to our kind of currency. And having just retired from the Navy, living on my Navy retirement only, I was pretty tempted to take that, but some little sense back here in the corner said don't do it. It probably was that same little bird that told me I had to save it in the first place. Not long after the bubble burst, some of the Japanese investors that bought cars found that the values tumbled tremendously. One car had sold for $13 million, for which the Japanese had borrowed $9 million from the bank. The banks wanted their money back. He didn't want to continue paying them for a car worth less than half of what he had paid. It left to an interesting standoff of, here, pay me, I don't want to take your car, just give me my payments kind of situation. Fortunately, I didn't fall into that trap. I did have one call to sell the car before it was shown at Pebble Beach, which was the first time it had been seen in public in 35 years, I guess, for just at $2 million. At that point in time, I was not even tempted. We knew that this was a unique car. We had the history of it. We were going out, felt privileged to be invited to go to Pebble, and then to win the competition class, first in class, and on top of that, to have Piero Ferrari give us the Enzo Trophy for the best Ferrari of all the cars, all the Ferrari classes at Pebble, was unbelievable. I guess one item I would like to address is that it's interesting that at Ferrari car shows in particular, a lot of the new Ferrari owners come along and look at this car and say, well, what on earth is that? One thing I would like to offer to them is that the whole mystique of the Ferrari name comes from the early history built by cars like this one the TDF that you see out here, the 212s that are around. The Ferrari name was made in the early 50s and has carried forward since that time. So if you own a Ferrari now, and are new Ferrari owners, I would ask that you take some time and get invested in the history of what your car came from. The fact that today the Testarossa, one word, came from the early 1956 four-cylinder race car called a Testarossa, a two-word name meaning redhead, coming from the color painted on the cylinder heads of that particular car. The Mondial of the 1980s was named after this car. Although this was a four-cylinder car, I guess the Mondial can be a double four-cylinder car and things. Bottom line is, go learn about the early history. Why does Ferrari have that mystique? Why are people drawn to Ferrari? It's built on the early racing history and the continuous success over the years.